Hi guys, in this video we'll be looking at dot point 3 Principles of Training. Now in your syllabus there are 6 principles of training, but for purposes here to make it easier for you to remember, we're actually using the acronym CROWS TV, as you can see it down the side with my beautiful drawing. Okay, so CROWS TV stands for Cool Down, Reversibility, Overload, Warm Up, Specificity, Training Thresholds and Variety. Now in our syllabus, in our syllabus, warm up and cool down are placed together, so that's why you have 6, but here we have 7. Now what students actually have to do with the syllabus dot point is analyse how the principles can actually be applied to both an aerobic and a resistance training program. So actually have to apply each of these principles in practice in an aerobic and a resistance training program, and we'll make sure we go through that in class. So for any training program, you need to make sure that you apply all these principles to ensure that you get the effect that you want from the training. So the first principle is progressive overload, which basically means that gains or adaptations will occur only if the training load is greater than normal and places greater stress on the body. For progressive overload to be applied, we usually use the FIT principle, which is the frequency, intensity, time and type. So the frequency of the training can be increased, but generally you need to do it at least 2 to 3 times a week. The intensity, based on what type of sport it is, the time that you're doing it, at least 20 to 30 minutes if it's an aerobic training program, and the type needs to obviously be important to the sport that you're using. So in this picture you can see that we apply a load to the body and the body adapts to this load. Sorry about that. That the body adapts to this load, gets stronger, gets faster, gets, the heart gets stronger, and so we need to increase this load for adaptations to occur again. So eventually the body gets used to this load and we need to increase it again. And this can be applied to both an aerobic and resistance training program. For an aerobic training program, we would maybe run 5Ks, and as it gets easier, we'd run 6, 7, 8, or maybe we'd run 5Ks twice a week instead of 3 times a week instead of twice a week. We try to run it faster. So all these different ways to progressively overload the body. An example here is of a resistance training progressive overload example. So 100 kilos for 10 reps, you're having 2 minutes rest with 3 sets. So you might increase the number of sets, so up to 4. You might decrease the rest time. You might increase the number of reps you do, or you might increase the weight. Generally, most people increase the weight because we want to lift more and get stronger. Specificity basically means that we need to train specifically for our sport, and whatever we specifically train for, we will cause changes to that. So this could be growth in the muscles, so muscles train. So if we're doing bench, we're going to get growth in our chest. It could be for the speed of the sport that we're doing. So if we're training fast, it might be for power or speed in the sport. The intensity of the activity or training needs to be specific for the sport as well. Okay, the movements that we use within the sport also need to be trained. So not just the intensity of the training, but if we're throwing, catching, shooting, we need to practice that as well. It needs to be specific for the sport. And of course the energy systems that are used in the sport we need to train for. If it's an aerobic based activity, then we need to train the aerobic energy system. If it's anaerobic and it's generally ATP PC system, we need to train for that. So it's important that the training is specific for your sport. And again, we need to apply this to a resistance training program and an aerobic training program. And in Canvas, you'll see that there are some videos, and you can look at those, and they give you some really good examples of applying these principles. And I suggest you go and have a look at all those videos specifically on specificity, and it gives you some really good examples for resistance training. Reversibility basically means that if the training adaptations will only last for as long as we train, so if you don't use it, you'll lose it. And this reversibility is called the detraining effect. So if we stop training, then all those gains that we made during that time will be lost, and really dependent on the athlete as well as the type of gains they've made will depend on how long it takes. Usually you lose greater gains, greater loss in strength than aerobic fitness, and this can start to happen within 2 to 3 weeks of not training, and it can disappear within 8 to 12 weeks of not doing any training. So that's why athletes who are injured really want to get back into training as quickly as possible, and the coach does too, to try and avoid this principle occurring, and to avoid all that training, all the hard work that they've done to be lost very quickly. In this little picture here, you can see there's a normal muscle, and if we don't work it or we don't use it, it atrophies and we lose muscle size. Lots of people think that when you stop training for resistance, your muscle turns to fat. No such thing. All that happens is the muscle gets smaller and it looks like there's basically less space, and you might get a little bit softer and put on a bit of weight. So the muscle just gets smaller but doesn't actually change into fat. Variety is important to ensure that you're actually training sufficiently for the sport, as well as that the athlete is physically prepared, and also it prevents boredom. So a sport like netball requires strength, aerobic, anaerobic and flexibility training, and this will ensure that the athlete can fully participate in their sport. So examples of using variety in a resistance training program might be using different methods for resistance training. So free and fixed weights, we have machine weights, elastic bands and hydraulic training. So we could use those in our training program to keep it varied and keep it exciting for the athlete. As well as that, there's examples of some exercises that we could do for back. So we've got a bent over row, chin-ups, seated row and lat pull downs. Now we wouldn't do this every day. Every time we trained back, we'd change up the exercises as well. So next time we might do single arm rows, we might do some pull-ups instead of chin-ups. You might do some deadlifts, something like that. So you'd make sure that you changed it up so that you didn't get bored, and your muscles also kept changing and growing, so that progressive overload as well. Aerobic training, again, you change up the method, so fartlek, continuous aerobic interval and circuit. Remember, it has to be specific for the sport, so there's no point doing continuous training if it's a sprinting style activity. But you'd probably more than likely do circuit or aerobic interval training or fartlek. Variations to continuous training would be not just doing 10-kilometre treadmill runs, but you might decide that take the athlete outside and go for a run on varied terrain. This way you could use your fartlek training as well. Or you could also do some bike work, because as long as it's still aerobic and you don't do it all the time, it's good to just change it up and vary it. You might see people playing slightly different sports within their training, just to vary it up and to keep the athlete interested. It also helps to avoid overtraining and overuse injuries if you're continually using the same muscles all the time. Okay, so training zones or training thresholds, there are two thresholds. So this is the aerobic threshold, which is just under the yellow line, and the anaerobic threshold. And these are the lines that basically indicate where some improvements will be made. So for the yellow line, it's for aerobic training, and for the red line, it's for anaerobic training. The aerobic threshold is around 60% of your maximum heart rate. Training in this zone will cause improvements to your aerobic fitness, and that's between 60 to 80% of our max heart rate. Remember, we do have to train in here for at least 20 minutes to get some benefit. Then if we move up to the anaerobic threshold, it's about 85 to 90% of our heart, about 85% of our max heart rate, and this is where lactate starts to increase. Our body struggles to get the oxygen that it requires, so we know that if there's no oxygen, that breakdown of glucose doesn't fully occur, and it leads to lactic acid. So at this point, at that anaerobic threshold, the athlete's lactate levels will start to rise, also known as onset blood lactate accumulation, or LIP, lactate inflection point. I would suggest LIP, hell of a lot easier to remember. And athletes can only train in this anaerobic zone, which is about 90 to 100% of their max heart rate. It's great for anaerobic building. It can, if you do it for long periods of time, it can build both aerobic and anaerobic fitness, but we know that we can only be in this zone for short periods of time before they have to drop back into the aerobic zone. Warm-ups and cool-downs are important for all sports and for all training programs. They increase range of motion, they reduce injury risk, they prepare the body both physically and mentally. Generally, cool-downs also bring the body back down to its pre-exercise state, help to reduce the build-up of waste products, and ensure that everything goes back down to normal levels. If you want to have a read of the benefits, you can just pause the video at any time and write some things down in your book if you want some more points. And that's the end of our video.